All right. Hello. Welcome to all our panelists and everyone watching. We are here to talk about how to unionize Planned Parenthood and everywhere else in the reproductive rights sector. My name is Cora Courier. I am an editor at Lux, which is a new socialist feminist magazine. Our second issue just went out to subscribers. It's a print magazine, so we got it in your mailboxes by now, we hope. And you can also read some articles from the newest issue online now at luxmagazine.com, and including that among those is Amy Littlefield's new deep dive into the campaign to organize Planned Parenthood and tech affiliates in Texas last spring amid the pandemic. Amy's article chronicles the longstanding complaints that workers had about being overworked and underpaid, mold in some offices, other issues that they'd been, thinking about organizing around for a long time. And all of that boiled over in the high stress of the pandemic, as people working as frontline healthcare workers. And then to top it off, Texas attempted to ban all abortions. And so these folks had to call people and tell them that they couldn't get procedures they desperately needed. It was a traumatizing period. Amy's article does an incredible job just getting inside the day-to-day struggle that precipitated this campaign for them to try to form a union. And then the backlash that followed very quickly. Within a matter of days, people were laid off. So according to Planned Parenthood, this was about the fiscal constraints brought on by the pandemic, but workers saw it as retaliation. And so Amy's article is great because it puts this particular campaign in the context of the wave of organizing that's going on across the nonprofit sector, where people have been told for a long time that if they love their job and they're passionate about making a difference, they should be willing to work for low pay, and that anything they complain about will be hurting the cause. And that's especially true when it comes to abortion. It's very hard to go out and criticize an organization like Planned Parenthood without it seeming like you're making common cause with the enemy on the right. So we're thrilled to have Amy's article in Lux. I hope you'll check it out. This is exactly the kind of article we founded Lux to run. We want to run pieces that hold these institutions to account, even when they are, broadly speaking, on our side. We don't accept that we're hurting the left, hurting the reproductive rights agenda, hurting feminism, if we speak candidly about long-standing problems at these institutions. And we do it from a place of good faith and strengthening the movement by strengthening the workers within it. So we're thrilled to have Amy's article, and I'm thrilled to have a number of the people that are featured in the article here to talk with us tonight about their experiences organizing their workplaces and what lessons we can take from that. So I'm going to introduce the panelists. We'll have some questions from Amy. And if you have something to ask, feel free to tweet at us at ReadLux on Twitter or ReproJobs, or drop them in the comments. And I should mention this panel is being co-hosted by ReproJobs, which is a great organization advocating for workers across this sector. And we are very happy to both have them featured in the article and to be co-hosting this event with them. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, I will start with Amy. I'm the author of the article that we're here to talk about. Amy is a freelance journalist covering reproductive health care. She was part of the union organizing campaign at Rewire News Group as well. And then we have in avatar form, Luna Lovegood, who is a Black feminist organizer and the co-founder of ReproJobs. ReproJobs keeps their identities anonymous so they can talk frankly about what's happening in workplaces. Then we have Emily Escobar. She's a former national campus organizer with the Feminist Majority Foundation, and she was also part of the FM Union's organizing committee. And we have Genevieve Oliver, and she's a fundraiser for the Center for Reproductive Rights and the unit chair of the Center for the Reproductive Rights Union. And Kyla, who worked at Planned Parenthood Federation of America in DC from 2016 to 2019, and she's currently works in the labor movement. And finally, last but not least, Emily Binford, who is also featured in the article. She worked as a healthcare assistant at Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas from 2018 until 2020. And she and her co-workers formed an organizing committee and spearheaded a union campaign across the affiliate, which came to a head in spring of 2020. So we're going to get into all of that and much more. And I will turn it over to Amy now.
Thank you so much, Cora. I'm so excited to be here having this conversation with all of you, and really honored to be alongside the workers who are on the front lines of organizing in this space. And before I start, I want to just shout out Lux Magazine and encourage anyone who doesn't already have a subscription to get a subscription. It is beautiful, it's glossy, it's fun to read. And the other thing I want to say in the interest of the theme of this panel is that Lux is one of the few progressive outlets out there that puts their money where their values are, and paid me $1 a word for this article, which took many months to report and investigate and fact check. So please support them. And, you know, as Cora mentioned, this issue is personal to me. I've organized myself at the sort of nexus of, you know, the Trump administration that was very anti-abortion, very anti-labor, and was sort of the only recourse with the National Labor Relations Board and an employer and, you know, foundation grant money that is always scarce. And it's a really challenging, tense space to organize in. So I'm really excited to be part of having this conversation and moving it forward. One of the things I want to bring people's attention to is sort of the urgency of having this conversation in this moment right now. We are on the precipice of potentially an end to legal abortion in many states in this country in the coming years, if not months. And you're about to meet some of the workers who are on the front lines of organizing in that very intense, traumatizing, important space. You know, workers who are doing the work of fundraising at the organization that's going to be defending the right to legal abortion before the Supreme Court. Workers who are at some of the leading feminist organizations in this country, Feminist Majority and Planned Parenthood, or former workers, I should say, and workers who were dealing, as Cora mentioned, with the very traumatizing impact of Texas's attempt to ban abortion, and, you know, organizing and standing in solidarity with their coworkers in that moment. So I'm really excited to be having this conversation now. And I want to turn it over to Luna Lovegood and encourage anyone who's watching, who's in the repro space, who's thinking about unionizing or thinking about banding together with your coworkers, organizing for better conditions as you do this important work, to check out ReproJobs. They're the organization that is always shouting out toxic bosses, encouraging us to drink water, posting job descriptions and calling them out when they don't have salaries and benefits listed. And they're really, in the article, I call them a digital workers center for the movement. And I think that's true. So I want to turn it over to Luna to talk about sort of the strides that the repro movement has made in recent months and, you know, the past couple of years in terms of unionizing and moving that ball forward. So the infamous but anonymous Luna Lovegood.
Hi, everyone. I'm Luna Lovegood, she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the founders of ReproJobs. I'm anonymous in doing a probably bad impression of Luna Lovegood to disguise my voice a bit, so enjoy. We are so glad that you're joining us tonight. A huge thank you to Lux Magazine for hosting this panel with us, and to Amy Littlefield for her fantastic reporting. If you haven't read the piece yet, please do. For those of you who are new to us, ReproJobs is an online community of workers in the reproductive health, rights, and justice movements, and we believe in the radical idea that organizations within the reproductive health, rights, and justice movements can lead the progressive movement by providing healthy, supportive, and empowering workplace environments that include inclusive cultures, generous policies, and thriving wages. We used to just post jobs, but pivoted a few years ago because we were sick and fucking tired of the lack of attention being paid in our movement to anti-Blackness, racism, and all of the isms. And to be honest, the way in which it completely thrives in our workplaces and why we're probably getting our asses kicked writ large. Hermione and I have both worked in the repro movement for a decade and kept thinking that things might change, but clearly they wouldn't on their own with current toxic leadership and inability to create a thoughtful pipeline of young leaders of color, queer folks, disabled folks, immigrants, and the people we serve. We were also disappointed to see the amount of union busting and, frankly, shitty pay and benefits at many of these organizations that claim the higher ground over anti-abortion organizations. We've heard the feedback that if we talk about these issues, we're hurting the movement, but we don't believe that. We believe that not talking about these issues allows them to continue to harm workers, and we believe that it will continue to stop the necessary change that we all need to make our workplaces better. We use a multitude of approaches, such as offering resources like our analysis of paid parental leave policies in our movement and our salary report and database. But we also call out organizations that are and continue to be hostile and harmful to their workers. One of those call-out tactics that we've used is supporting workers to speak out about their experiences and receiving the tools they need to unionize, which is really exciting because since we've started, almost 20 workplaces in the repro movement have unionized, which is fucking fantastic. And that's also what the workers on this call will be talking about today. Another is working with investigative reporters to talk about what's happening to workers in repro and our labor issues, because they should be covered within the larger labor movement's issues. But also, the sad fact is that many organizations in our movement won't make changes unless there's a scathing article highlighting their internal workplace issues and leadership's racism. So, in order to create those changes, we need you to keep speaking out and also read all of the articles, including Amy's article, as well as those that have been published in the Washington Post, the Lily, so many in the Daily Beast, BuzzFeed, and New Republic. And then, of course, Sarah Jaffe's book, Work Won't Love You Back. So we're really excited for you to hear from the workers, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. You can always email us at hello@reprojobs.org. And of course, find us complaining on social media. We love you all, and we're honored to have sponsored this panel. Thank you.
So I want to open with a question to Emily Binford. And Emily, if you've read the article, you know that Emily Binford was on the front lines working as a healthcare worker in an abortion clinic in Austin, Texas. We all remember those scary weeks of the pandemic, but Emily was out there showing up to work every day, taking care of patients who had urgent reproductive health care needs. And what Emily and the other workers described to me for the story was a real lack of direction from management that was making them feel really frightened to show up to work every day and making them feel like, you know, they didn't have a clear sense of how to protect themselves and each other. And then on top of that, they were told that they wouldn't be getting paid sick leave if they got COVID and had to stay home. And as the article lays out, when the workers decided to organize and circulate a petition, it was leaked to management, and 3 days later, many of them were laid off. So Emily, I would love to turn it over to you to talk about the two most important lessons that the unionizing campaign that you and your colleagues underwent in Texas can teach to the movement at large.
Sure. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this union campaign. And I think the biggest lessons that I took away kind of go hand in hand. The first is really just to remember to trust your coworkers. That organizing is really all about those relationships that you build between fellow workers. And even though we get involved with unions and we feel that the ultimate goal is to get that union contract. One of the things that I found that I really didn't anticipate is that sometimes union goals can be a little bit not completely overlapping with worker goals. And that can be difficult because we're allies, but when they do come into conflict, the most important thing to do is just fall back on your coworkers and the people that you trust. I think the only regret I have from that campaign, which was very difficult, was getting a little bit lost in those fast-paced decisions that can happen when the fire really gets going, and you're trying to get signatures and build the union support, is not listening to the people closest to me in my organizing committee. And even though I learned so much from the union that we were working with, it's just important to remember that they have goals to advance the labor movement as a whole. And organization is really just about that, the worker solidarity, and that you can always fall back on that. So.
Thanks for that, Emily. It reminds me of something that another Emily Likens-Ellers, who writes a fantastic column for ReproJobs called Ask a Union Organizer, likes to say, which is that the union is the workers. There isn't sort of a difference between the union over here and the workers over here. You've got to make sure that, you know, the union is the people that you're mobilizing with, and that's where your, you know, demands and direction are coming from. So thanks for making that point. I want to turn next to Emily Escobar. Emily, you used to work at Feminist Majority Foundation, which, you know, I know myself and many others who started out as, you know, with feminist organizing on college campuses know the FMLA chapters at university campuses that organize around feminist issues. FMF is one of the big institutional feminist nonprofits out there that has also been, you know, the subject of much needed criticism in recent years, including for institutional racism within the ranks. I'm sure some of you saw the article in The Nation magazine this week about how some of the statements by the Feminist Majority Foundation were kind of weaponized leading up to the invasion of Afghanistan and used to justify that. So Emily, I know this is something you think about deeply, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the rise of reproductive justice as a framework within reproductive healthcare is connected to unionization, and how organizations, unions like yours, were bringing forward issues of racial injustice, class, intersectionality as part of your unionizing campaign.
Definitely. So, you know, some of our younger workers or workers of color, we understand that it's not enough to simply advocate for the freedom of choice. Lawmakers have continuously passed legislation that bars access for the most vulnerable communities. Luna listed them, you know, young folks, disabled folks, immigrant folks, folks of color, low-income folks, the list goes on. And so the right to have an abortion is the floor, not the ceiling. So I feel like we've really re-envisioned what the movement looks like to be more inclusive to those who are most affected by the issue. And we know it's crucial that our internal work reflects that just as much as our external work does. And so I feel like union organizing has become that sort of empowering way for us to really speak out and hold those leaders accountable. Because most of the time, you know, we're the folks that are on the ground doing the work. And that means that, you know, we demand as much respect and dignity as the faces of the movement and those who have been around in this movement longer than we have. So I think that union campaigns have really helped us realize our value and the value and knowledge that we carry when it comes to these issues. So something that I always advocate for is that it's way past time for older leaders to pass the torch down to the new generation of the movement, because we're the ones who are really, you know, envisioning a world that is much different than some of the feminist goals, even in the past couple of years. And so I think kind of giving us the mic and letting us take the platform the way we want to, and really make sure that we're advocating for, you know, all of these communities that are going to be most affected, because that's the only way that we will be able to move forward as a movement as a whole.
Awesome. And I think that's so tied to the conversation that ReproJobs is helping to head up at a national level, and tied in with the sort of racial justice reckoning that's happening at Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas, across all of these institutional feminist nonprofits. That's so important. Kyla, I want to turn to you next. You were part of the bargaining of the first contract at Planned Parenthood Federation of America at the DC office. Which, you know, it's, as I say in the article, hard to overstate the power of Planned Parenthood as a safety net healthcare provider, as a political force. And, you know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how organizations that we may be drawn to because of their values may sort of fail to hold those values dear when the rubber meets the road and they actually sit down at the bargaining table to hash out the nitty-gritty of a contract. I'm curious to hear how you experience that at Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, and if there's two things that I want to like get out there, it's like, I hope this doesn't happen to you, but I've not heard yet that this hasn't happened. And it's not just a repro thing, it's like a sort of progressive thing in general, where a lot of organizations to the world, they're going to be like, we support workers' rights. We have to make sure there's a union bug on everything. Labor movement, we have to like make sure that we are like being good allies to those in labor. But when you go into that conference room and you're sitting across a big old mahogany table from each other, like sometimes they will argue things and it'll make you want to like pull up your emails or like the social media and be like, didn't we just, we're saying this to the public. And so I just want people to be prepared. I hope, you know, maybe there's a unicorn organization out there where like they completely adhere, like the external values and the internal values are the same, but like I've not yet heard of it where it completely happens that way. And so to just sort of be prepared that sometimes they fall a little short, which is no secret because that's why you're unionizing to begin with, is to protect yourself. And in addition to that, sometimes like, you know, they fall short on the mission, but I also want to impress upon people, like sometimes they will even try to use the mission as a shield to be like, we cannot give you this because it'll hurt our patients, or we can't pay you that much because it's going to hurt our people. And to be clear, we also do that to ourselves sometimes. Like, how many times have y'all worked super late or answered an email on the weekend because you're like, I need to help one more person, I need to help one more person. So, you know, this mission thing is being used as a shield, but I want folks to remember that whatever your mission is never at odds with workers' rights, because they all intersect. Workers' rights is going to touch repro, racial, economic, like all of these like justice that we're fighting for, they all intersect. And so whoever you're helping, they're going to need workers' rights. And in order for you to help them, you also need workers' rights. And so don't let that sort of head in the back, or the voice in the back of your head, say that like by fighting for your rights, you are damaging the mission, as we, you know, sort of said as a theme of the panel, because it's an act of care. Unionizing is an act of care. It's an act of care for you, your coworkers, your patients, everybody. And so those are sort of like two things I think are really important to keep in mind as you're sitting at that bargaining table, when sometimes you're just like, ah! Like, just remember you're doing it for the mission and you're doing it for yourself. And don't be surprised when some things happen that you're not expecting from them.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Kyla. And, you know, that piece about how frustrating bargaining can be is not something I realized myself until I was sitting there at the bargaining table. It is painstaking and sometimes very boring and sometimes very tense. And sometimes campaigns like the Planned Parenthood campaign, Kyla, that you were a part of, it took 4 years, right? From when it started until when things were public and an agreement was actually underway. So I'm curious to hear, Genevieve, from you about your experience at the Center for Reproductive Rights, which is you know, one of the leading reproductive health law firms that's out there, hearing, you know, arguing cases before the Supreme Court on abortion rights. why is this worth it? Is it worth it? You know, it takes so much time and effort. And I don't want to, you know, leave us on a demoralizing note. So tell us your thoughts on that.
So thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you for inviting me to be the, I don't think my answer is that much of a buzzkill, but I appreciate ending it on a practical note. So one, I will say the caveat that our bargaining period lasted only 1 year, which is a lot less than what a lot of other organizations in our movement and beyond in the progressive space and journalism and beyond have experienced. So I can only speak for myself that 1 year was enough, and it did feel like a slog, and it did feel draining. I will say that it is 100% worth it if you have the right mindset going in, and I think that's kind of a key part of this and a key lesson learned for me. What made everything worth it for me is the solidarity that this process kind of brings out and evokes in people who participate, and I think that solidarity is powerful enough to rest this process and to rest a union on, and to rest, you know, to help cancel out emotionally the like amplified feelings of burnout and frustration that this process can cause in a movement perennially characterized by burnout and frustration in many ways. So my, I guess, word of advice and a big takeaway for me was that hating your job and being pissed off at your boss is fine, and in fact I encourage it, and in fact that's great. But if that's the primary thing motivating you wanting to unionize, you need to sit and think a little harder and think about what is that's not going to carry you through over a year of organizing. What is going to carry you through that time is that solidarity with your colleagues, as Emily B was talking about earlier, that sort of knowing that you have those people to come back to. It's also not going to be enough to bring on board people who might be like, well, what about the dues I have to pay? I mean, we also live, as Luna pointed out, in a very underpaid movement. And even though dues are pretty negligible, 2% of your salary, it's the equivalent of like one paycheck. This was my spiel to everybody that I gave, and it's sort of the price that we pay for being able to have this collective worker power. For people who are underpaid, living in the most expensive cities in the US, they have to really feel there's a damn good reason for why their money is being taken away. And you have to sell that to them. And just hating your boss is not enough to sell that to them, you know? But that whole, we have power together, look at the collective power we have together, is really meaningful and powerful to everybody, I think. That's sort of the experience that I've had. I wrote down what I was thinking, so let me just make sure I didn't forget anything. I guess I would reframe how you think about this process, and try to reframe how the rest of your bargaining unit thinks about the process, to be about more than sticking it to the man, and that's important, but also being about what can we do to do the most good for the largest amount of people, and particularly for the people who get paid the least. You know, sometimes those of us who get paid more will have to make sacrifices so that those who get paid the least can you know, be elevated however possible. And I think that we did make some serious, really exciting gains in our contract. We got 4 months of parental leave. We got increased starting salaries. They guaranteed they would never pay anybody less than $50,000. We got back a professional development stipend that they had taken away. And we got increased and broad non-discrimination protections, just cause, a bunch of other things. But at the end of the day, those are amazing takeaways. But what continues to resonate is the fact that even people who were scared of showing up for like the kind of small demonstrations and small actions we took, even the people who were scared of showing up showed up because of the solidarity piece. And to me, that was a sort of powerful takeaway from the whole experience, and why I decided to run for unit chair, even though I was so burned out and exhausted by this whole process. But the possibility of that expanding and continuing is really exciting. So I think, yeah, does that answer the question? I think so.
Yeah, that's awesome. And, you know, I think it's awesome, Genevieve, that as you all head into the fire that is going to be the next months and years of legal fights to defend reproductive health care for all of us. You know, your employees are going to have 16 weeks of paid parental leave and better salaries and working conditions. So I think that really speaks to Luna's point about how unionizing can strengthen the movement rather than hurting the movement and the cause. We have a question coming in from the audience for Emily, which is, to the Texas staff, how did you successfully organize staff that felt protective of the organization despite the lack of hazard pay and other conditions that are laid out in the article? And were you able to convince admin staff to realize that they're also workers? And the person who submitted this question said they work at another affiliate that's unionizing. It's happening, but it's slow. Emily, do you want to respond to that?
Okay, I'm assuming it's me, Emily. But I will say, especially in Texas, just because we're so sprawling, this was the big obstacle that we came up against, was trying to get connected, because Greater Texas covers so much land, really. And as for really how you start, I really love that kind of fallback tenant, first friend, best friend. So just really making connections with the people that are closest to you is how I started, and really just focusing on those bonds. So that's really where you start, and then you just try to kind of like grow your bubble. As for admin staff, that is more difficult than clinic staff. Clinic staff are easier because we're all together. We have the same like gripes and struggles. We're frontline workers, and we just have a little bit more solidarity than admin. We did make connections with admin towards the end. I would recommend reaching out to people that do outreach, just because, or just things that you feel like are more public facing first, and then kind of work your way in that way. And then I think once you just try to make a connection with each department and have them build relationships. And there's kind of like a very strategic way to have people be like assigned people that you try to like make connections with, and spread it out. But if you have more specific, like Planned Parenthood type questions, I would love to talk with you personally. I can somehow provide you my email or something, but you can, yeah. I wish I knew more about what's going on in Texas. I want to help Texas Planned Parenthood.
And just ReproJobs is there partly as a connector of people.
Yes.
So anyone wants to reach out to ReproJobs, would find a way to connect. I think part of the behind the scenes work of ReproJobs is connecting people at different affiliates. So it's partly why they're serving in this amazing worker center role. I want to sort of zoom out and look at some of the structural issues, and also encourage people to submit questions as we go along on Twitter via DM or reply to the Lux Magazine Twitter account. So I want to look at some of the structural issues that exist both in healthcare overall in this country, and also within our particular area of healthcare, which is reproductive healthcare. One of the points that Jenny Brown, who's an amazing feminist author, makes in the article is, wait a minute, let's take a step back and look at how did we become reliant on these tiny, relatively tiny, right, nonprofits that are, foundation funded, that are always scrambling for money. Like, how is this the system that we are relying on for our reproductive health care? And when we look around at other countries where they might have, publicly funded healthcare or access to abortion and contraception without this sort of scarcity that we're dealing with here, how do we dream big, and how is unionizing a way to sort of think about some of these big structural issues within the healthcare system? And can this sort of alliance of labor and reproductive healthcare workers, help us in thinking big and moving that along? Maybe we'll start with Luna on that question, and then anyone else can chime in.
Oh, hey, didn't think you were going to be throwing to me. Hi. Wait, I lost my British accent. Shit. Well, I think what's really important about organizing all of this is that we actually follow the lead of workers. I think the way in which our movement kind of organizes right now is that, we kind of follow what the managers and the CEOs want, and it's kind of fuck what the actual workers want. And so we actually think that's a microcosm of how our movement organizes in general, because we kind of ignore what's happening on the state, what the local organizations want. And so we think that it's important that everybody has a full say, but that we actually follow the leads of workers, and that you all start organizing based on what your needs are and the solidarity there. So sorry, hop on. I think Genevieve wants to go next.
Yeah, I can speak to that question. I think that, well, I am a fundraiser at the center, so I am not a lawyer and I am not a legal expert. I was an English and art history double major. So this is like, my viewpoints on the law are definitely informed by the fact that I just write all the grant proposals and reports. But part of me thinks that the reason why it feels like these huge rights that are integral to our day-to-day lives rest on hardly anything is because legally they do. Like Roe is one decision, and every subsequent abortion rights decision rests on that, and Roe rests on one phrase of the 14th Amendment. It's like such a small and limited and tenuous fragment that protects these like fundamental rights to, choose if and when you want to get pregnant and what you want to do with that pregnancy, which is a huge moment in anyone with the physical capability to do that's life. And I think part of because that whole framework is so tenuous, it feels like our response to that as a movement has been so defensive and so also kind of like resting on this single tenuous phrase. And I think something that Emily E. was pointing out earlier is sort of that like the shift in the movement with the younger generation is to think, okay, well, we can't be on the back foot all the time. Like, why are we not working toward our vision of something that is actually like, what's the human rights phrase? Like a positive rights protective framework, rather than being defensive all the time. And that is a hallmark of the reproductive justice framework, is the idea that it is a forward-looking movement toward a positive framework of rights for the entire meaning of what reproductive rights and justice is. So I think that forming a union and that kind of the worker power that is signified by that is also part of that expansive vision of like a positive rights framework. Like we don't just have to be on our back foot in terms of complaining about our bosses anonymously on the internet, on Twitter, or like on the Teams chat, or like via text message. We can take a kind of positive step toward actually defining what our workplace conditions are. So that's what I would say on the subject, I guess.
I'm going to jump in with a question. I am very interested in the ways in which some of these big nonprofits can start to just act like corporations, right? Like they are mission driven ostensibly, and they're you know, fighting for progressive causes, but when it comes to their own workplaces, they're basically, you know, basically mirroring the corporate world, and they're very resistant to workers' rights and also to like just taking more aggressive stances sometimes on issues like race, issues like economic inequality, right? There's sort of a narrow focus on rights, like the right to abortion, and less on the right to everything else that we know goes into reproductive justice. I'm curious to hear from you all, like why, in your experience working at these nonprofits, like why are they so resistant to thinking about things in structural ways to workers' rights? Is it donor agendas? Is it, you know, catering to the money? Is it just, you know, some inherent conservatism once you get to a certain size of bureaucracy? But I'm curious, I mean, you're all at different size and different types of orgs, but I'm curious what's been your experience.
Hi, it's Luna. I can hop in here for a second. Part of it is that some of the leadership within our movement are people who've actually never had to access the services or had to struggle in their lives. So they're just so fucking distant from the daily lives of some of their lower level workers or the people that we serve. And then on top of that, they are funded by foundations that actually make their money on avoiding taxes and exploiting all of our communities. We all know where some of the largest funding comes from, and that is from corporations that family foundations where families actually are just avoiding paying taxes. And it's kind of wild because then we could have a national health system if they would just pay their damn taxes, but they refuse. And so when you have a system of like a donor class and CEOs who are all making, I don't know, several hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's kind of really difficult to understand why your interns or your low-level staff are having a problem with a $35,000, $40,000 salary in New York. Also, because you're pretty comfortable, so you're not necessarily interested in making large-scale changes because your funders and your donors are actually deeply invested in capitalism. So why would you actually make those changes? And I think that was what we've seen as part of the leadership change, and why we have so many CEOs that simply kind of walk into positions unilaterally without actually having to move up from internships or frontline worker experiences. It's really, there's not actually a pipeline in our movement for folks of color, queer folks, immigrants, poor folks to become leaders. There's actually just, we take one ladder and then they take this glass elevator into the higher level positions, and it just recreates all of the exact same problems that are in corporations. Just because we're nonprofit doesn't mean that we're not corporations in the way that most Fortune 500 corporations act. We still replicate those same inequality issues.
Yeah, adding on to Luna's point, I really think it's about white supremacy and the fact that these unions are calling that out, and these leaders are perpetrating those systems that continue to disproportionately impact marginalized communities. And so, you look at the traditional organizations like the Feminist Majority Foundation, you look at the donors and more affluent white women who, again, to Luna's point, probably never had to go through these barriers to access abortion care. And so it's kind of like a reality check for them, and they don't want to face that. They don't want to be called out on their problematic behavior. So one of their ways to sort of avoid that is to really avoid unions and avoid recognizing the unions in general.
Yeah, I mean, something that we talked about in our first editor's note in issue 1 of Lux, and like what part of why we made it too, is just this feeling, that disconnect, right? Like that disconnect between some of these large institutional feminist organizations and the grassroots, and also the sort of vaguely activated but not yet organized or politically, or people who had a ton of political energy but nowhere to put it, right? Like nowhere to say, like, where do I sign up, right? And all you get is endless fundraising emails: chip in $5 here, chip in $5 there, the right to row is under attack, the row is under attack. And no sense of, how do I actually join? What do I actually do to build power around these issues and to build feminist power in the US. So I think that, it's related, the same issue of the sort of disconnect between some of these institutions that we think of as American feminism and the feminism that's actually being enacted through workers like all of you.
I think, like what everyone has said, we're putting a Band-Aid on a systemic issue of inequality across the United States. And on top of that, and so because we have this problem where we have inequality, we then must pander to a donor class. And I worked in development at a small nonprofit, and I realized that is what having an entire group of employees that their entire job is just asking rich people for money to fund essential services. And that's just so inefficient. If you could just have like a government system, it just would really like kind of reroute some vital resources. There's a really great book about this this is really my main point, that there's a wonderful book about this called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, the nonprofit industrial complex, explaining this issue where activists that want to get into this kind of work feel that the only way that they can do it is by going and working for nonprofits, where then their labor is monetized, and then they're taken advantage of by these organizations that say that they stand for the mission, but really are taking advantage of workers' labor. And nonprofit is totally a misnomer. You're definitely making money, even if when you're a CEO. That's the other thing. Like I've seen, if you look at the tax documents, it's nasty. So I highly recommend that book. Those are the big systemic issues that I see.
Genevieve, did you want to chime in on that point as a fundraiser who's been there in the trenches yourself?
Yeah, I basically, I think that you have a moment as a fundraiser where you learn how to read a 990, and then you're just like, oh my God. And you find that's like a very radicalizing moment, like being like, yes, these people are hoarding money. Like, yes, they are just sitting on several $1 million and letting that money generate more money, and they donate that money, but they are essentially just sitting on millions and millions of dollars. And that is a pretty radicalizing moment. I think that part of the challenge of sort of being in the fundraising space is sort of like you're essentially acting as the enforcer of capitalism. Like that's the kind of like the whole way that it's supposed to work is that wealthy people who make it out of the system give back to their communities. But then there's this thing where they're not just going to give back to their communities unless you make them feel good about it. So that's kind of a morally challenging space to fill. I kind of feel like while we are stuck in this system, somebody has to do it. And because I'm a good persuasive writer, I will do it. But it is kind of like that makes the sort of union effort kind of all the more salient to me, like thinking, what are the ways that I can actually build power, and I'm not kind of like responsible for reproducing these systems of power, So I don't know. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for making that point. I want to bring in another like big picture thought in the article that I really appreciated, which came from Emily Likenzellers, who is maybe out there watching. If not, you should go read their columns on ReproJobs. So they have this big dream, right, that workers across all different industries are going to stand shoulder to shoulder to, you know, defend against anti-abortion laws. And they point out that if, for example, there's a nursing home that's closing down and it's unionized, you're going to have SEIU workers turn out. You know, I mean, I was down at a hospital picket line here in Massachusetts at St. Vincent recently, and like the trades, you know, workers were all out there. There were people in hard hats. Like, workers stand up for each other when union jobs are at stake. And so do we see this happening? Could this happen if repro workers join the labor movement in high enough numbers? Do we see a scenario where this Texas law is going to threaten to close down the abortion clinic and the workers are unionized? Come on, let's go. And we're going to defend that clinic. Kyla, I know you sort of crossed the line. You moved from the repro world to, you know, working in the labor movement now yourself. Is that a pipe dream, or could it happen? How do we think about that future possibility?
No, absolutely. I think it's happening. And, you know, we're in a moment where I think sort of because of things are happening like Rona, that people are suddenly like starting to realize, oh, unions. Do you remember unions? Those were like a really great thing. And so, you know, I think a lot of our movements have sort of been siloed from each other. But as we talk more about intersectionality and like we have more access to each other and to communicate via like Twitter, like I know these conversations were happening before about how all of our movements intersect, but I don't know if it was happening to this scale in public where everyone is sort of like seeing it. And so I have very high hopes, because that's why I joined the labor movement, is because to me, no one ever talked to me about unionizing at all. Like never, like they were a little bit isolated. And I think the labor movement, from what I'm seeing, they like want to do better in that way. They want to bring in the young workers and like build the labor movement of the future. And as we see more and more publicly, like the newsrooms organizing, repro orgs organizing, like I really, really hope that it's all going to start this big wave of momentum where people like sort of like, you know, are like, we've had decades of corporations sort of like taking over our government and taking over and like, you know, shooting capitalism straight into our like veins and like our minds. And that's how we think. And like now we're like, maybe that's not the way. And maybe we should be like going with like solidarity and like solidarity with each other across like race, class, gender. And so is it a pipe dream? I don't think it's a pipe dream. I think it is a dream, but I think that it is slowly happening. And I think that the key to it is like bringing in the people who understand that intersectionality and who are the young people who are now going to like build the movement for the future. That was a bunch of word salad.
Awesome. So we're just about at time. So I want to invite everyone to sort of give a 1 minute, you know, final thought as we end this conversation. And we'll start with Emily Escobar. Go for it.
Yeah, I guess my final thought would just be to not be afraid to hold these leaders accountable. You know, don't be afraid to speak up about things that you see that are, you know, problematic or that you feel are at the cost of workers of color, low-income workers, and really fight for what you believe in, because ultimately that's what's going to move the movement forward.
Awesome. Genevieve?
Yeah, well, one, thank you for listening in, people who are listening, and thank you, Lux, for hosting this, and ReproJobs for hosting this, and everybody else participated. I think what I would say, try to reframe how you think about the problems that you experience in your workplace to be like, I can solve these problems, and a great way to solve a lot of these problems, or at least to address them and to have a voice in them, is by forming a union. And going into it with that mindset of taking accountability for yourself as well and for your everyday working conditions, that is a great place to start from in terms of building solidarity and making it worthwhile for yourself. And ReproJobs has a whole page where they talk about how to form a union and answer questions about that. That's very useful. All of us our unions have Twitter accounts, so any of us can reach out to us at any time to ask for advice. And thank you for listening.
I think what I would want to leave y'all with is just if you're thinking about unionizing, or if you're currently unionizing and are in kind of that emotional struggle, which I know too well, what I found that comforted me is just know that even if you never get to the point that you have the union contract, if you leave the organization before that happens, just know that your work is valuable and you're doing so much for the movement as a whole, and you're doing so much for your coworkers and for workers across the state and across the United States. And we all appreciate your work. So thank you.
I can go next. I think the last thing I want to remind folks of is this can be very scary. It can be scary. It's going to be hard work, but you're surrounded by really great people and you're not going to have to do it alone. You're always going to be doing it with someone. And I know that people are in the repro movement without being a badass. Like, for some reason, that's somehow like a requirement. If you're in this movement, you're just like fantastic. And so even if it's scary and it's going to be a lot of hard work, you and your unit, your community are going to be able to do it. And go do it. Go form a union.
Luna, do you want to leave us with any final thoughts?
Sure. Fuck shitty managers, and let's get racism out of repro, because we're sick and tired of it. And come to us if there's anything. We take tips and all your DMs. But seriously, I think a lot of this is really scary and you can feel like you're alone. And what we try and tell you is, when you DM us, we promise you your coworkers are DMing us too. So just talk to your coworkers. You really don't need to come straight to us. Just talk to your coworkers, trust them.
Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone, for sharing these amazing experiences, and encourage everyone to check out ReproJobs, check out Lux, and I'll turn it over to Cora to wrap us up.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Really appreciate hearing everybody's stories, their experiences, and just like candid thoughts on where we are. And it takes a lot of courage to speak up, especially, you know, in these situations, in these this small community of people doing this work. So we really appreciate it. We hope that you'll all read Amy's article if you haven't yet. It's at Lux Magazine. That's lux-magazine.com. You can also, if you subscribe to Lux now, you will still get the second issue. And then 3 issues after that. We've got 3 issues a year. And we have profiles. We've got Amy's piece. We have a profile of an Indian labor rights activist who's at the front lines of the farmer strikes. We have movie reviews, book reviews, a series of we try to keep it light and heavy. You know, we've got features and lighter items, and I hope that you can check it out and subscribe. And we look forward to hosting more events like this and continuing to build a feminist community on the left. So thank you all so much for watching, and this will be recorded and we'll post it on our YouTube channels. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful evening.